Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. E.
And I am Bolton Mortimer, the Authenticator, and we apologize for the lateness and the technical difficulties. Whoop.
Yeah, regarding the lateness, I got called into work overtime last week, so I couldn't be here for the stream. And then when I got back home, I was so tired I just took a nap and forgot to change the date to this week. So I apologize for that.
hmm
So, yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the duality of man and warfare. Despite what some people would have you believe, men have been the primary people who have suffered due to war.
Yes, Miss Clinton, as per usual, you may promptly and with vigor go fuck yourself repeatedly.
And I understand why men are soldiers, men are physically stronger than women, despite what people would have you believe. And, if you're going to have soldiers to attack an enemy or to defend yourselves, they're going to pick the men to be the ones to do
Yeah.
it, obviously.
There's also the niggling little detail that, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, men are less valuable than women because women are the ones who carry the children and do the mate selecting, typically. Therefore, if you're going to use a particular demographic as disposable cannon fodder and only valuable for what they do rather than what they are, it's certainly not going to be the sex with or the gender with sentimental value. It's going to be the utilitarian you do or you are not a man
I mean,
category of humans.
even outside of warfare, men have always been the one who have taken more risks. Like, they would be the ones who would go out and hunt, facing off against dangerous animals.
Yeah, but that I I think what warfare essentially is the sort of male disposability or male utilitarianism taken to its logical conclusion. If you need disposable human bodies to throw at the enemy until the enemy is no more, it's going to be the male ones.
Well, I
Hence
think
why we always treat draft dodgers or people who don't go to war like bitches. But we also, in peacetime, tend to treat soldiers like bitches as well because we appreciate your ability to dehumanize your enemy when it's wartime, but when it's peacetime, we don't serve your kind in here, etc.
Well, the thing is, soldiers are trained to dehumanize their enemies. That's something they're actually taught when they go through military training.
Uh huh. And see, if I were designing a civilization, that would be my first clue that warfare is not a good idea. Any institution that
I don't.
requires you to dehumanize your fellow humans probably should have been scrapped and gone back to the drawing board.
Well, in the beginning of human civilization, warfare was fought over things like resources. We need this. They have this. They won't give it up, so
Yeah.
we have to go and take it.
Yeah, to be fair, also originally there were several different types of hominid, like in the time just before the last ice age or so. So
Yeah, but those
it
were
literally
those were.
was a genetic war, for lack of a better term. We
I think a lot
we
of those
we were
species
in
were
an ape
interbred,
war to
and
determine who was the best ape, basically.
yeah, because I believe they actually found a body like ancient remains of someone who was a hybrid between two types of hominids.
Yep. And to be fair, that was also an aspect of it. That which you couldn't kill, you banged and then took whatever was good about their genes for yourself. Which, of these two options, I have to tell you, the interspecies orgy is a hell of a lot more humane, for lack of a better word, than war. But that's just in my opinion, I guess.
I feel we're beginning to veer off topic,
Yeah, but that's yeah.
but initially war was fought for resources, but eventually human beings learned how to sustain themselves in like a certain area, like through farming and animal husbandry, and were able to, maintain themselves. So war was not necessarily needed to fight over food. but it was still fought over, like, say, rarer resources, like, say, if somebody had access to iron, or like somebody had access to, like, territory that was close to the sea for, trade routes, or even just wealth, gold, people would still go to war.
And then after that was even no longer an issue, we started having wars over abstract things, like how this particular civilization tries to organize said civilization is repugnant to my sensibilities, therefore let's go kill them. Or they worship different gods than I do, so let's go kill them. Or probably the earliest and most famous of the abstractions that justify war, they don't treat their women well, therefore let's go kill them.
Or even something like, they insulted my honor, therefore I'm going to take my army and go kill them.
Yeah, and lest we forget that one of the oldest Western standards of war stories is the Iliad, or the Trojan War, which, if Homer is to be believed, which, asterisk, but if Homer is to be believed, a large part of what the Trojan War was about was, oh, they stole my woman, therefore face that
I mean,
launched a
if you
thousand ships.
if you go back to even the stories before that, like, it was a woman that caused the Trojan War, not necessarily Helen of Troy, though she is, of fault, but, like, the goddesses, Eris, the goddess of chaos, offered a golden apple at a wedding to the most beautiful woman there, and I believe Athena, Minerva, and, sorry, not Athena is Minerva. Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera were there, and they decided that the Prince of Troy, Paris, would be the decider of who would get the apple, and they each offered them different prizes. He picked Aphrodite, and Aphrodite's prize was the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, which was the Helen of Troy.
I can we also, just for the purposes of, the Chad Yes thing, point out the fact that the origin of chaos in the Greek pantheon is a woman. Like, let's not even talk about the shit that Aphrodite got up to, and the famous betrayal that was Athena's betrayal of Medusa, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think every god
Eris, the
in,
original Regina George, lol.
I think, all of the Greek gods were like the embodiment of the worst aspects of humanity.
Well, I think they were the embodiments of all of human tendencies, or the source of all human tendencies taken to their logical extreme, which includes both the most noble aspects of humanity, but also the most fucked up aspects of humanity. Which, side note, in relation to the Apple story, and this is a complete, sidebar, but if it had been me, I would have just given it to Hera, on the basis that Hera is one of the most mistreated goddesses in all of Greek mythology. Given that, to the best of my knowledge, she and Zeus never conceived a child with each other, but as we all know, Zeus got around. And given especially that Hera is the goddess of marriage, that's gotta sting.
I'm pretty sure Hephaestus was their child.
I thought Hephaestus was one of the children of Zeus's previous wife that he ended up consuming. Kind of like Athena was born from Zeus's scalp,
I
which
don't
again,
remember.
that's gotta sting. Poor Hera.
I'm pretty sure Hephaestus was from Zeus and Hera, but again, we're getting into mythology, not warfare.
Yeah, the duality of men in mythology, especially in like a Jungian sense, might be another show unto itself. But back to war. What is it good for? Except, sorry.
Wasting human lives. But, you know, I think that war, in, at least in an evolutionary sense, was inevitable back when, we were basically monkeys in caves living with limited
No,
resources at the
when
time.
we organized each other into tribes, that sort of made war inevitable.
But is I think now. we could move beyond war, except that
We're very
we
good at
need to.
inventing new vectors of war, is the problem. That is one thing that human ingenuity is very, very good at doing, because we need to channel
We,
our innate desire for hierarchy and conflict into something, and very often it's some new strain of war, whether
yeah,
it's a
we.
religious war, whether it's a societal model war, or whether it is most recently a culture war.
Thing is, we still have tribes, and that we have, our nations, but it's not necessarily based around genetic lines. And the fact that we have different tribes isn't necessarily the reason that we fight. Now it's more ideology.
Yeah, I think even nation is kind of falling out of fashion as a demarcation of tribe, because as we all know, there are many, many people in many, many nations that think their own nation is the scum of the earth and idealize every other fucking nation on the earth. But I think the tribes of personal association, i.e., the ideological tribes or the subcultural tribes or those kind of tribes, are becoming more and more relevant as time goes by. And honestly, if we must have tribes, I would prefer the tribes that require self association than the tribes that you're just default born into, because that again strikes me as rather dehumanizing to just declare you were born in this random plot of land, therefore you are designed for this tribe and this tribe alone, and if you abide by any other tribe, then you're a traitor to your people, and that. I prefer the self-associated tribe, but then again, tribalism itself not healthy.
Well, it's less. I believe it's less of the fact that it's just somebody being born here. It's just that, like, when you're born there, usually your family is from there. You have deep history there. Like, usually that's where you're raised, and you develop connections to like that place and the people there.
Yeah, yeah, but and this is the tragic aspect of war. It often justifies the worst aspects of human nature by using the best aspects of human nature. Like again, usually in order to justify a war in the heads of the people fighting it, you have to give it some kind of moral dimension. And again, in particular, the famous those people don't do enough to protect and provide for their women, therefore we have to go over there and show them how to organize a society properly by destroying their society and replacing it with ours.
Yeah, even the Tyrion speech from season 2 of Game of Thrones, he told the soldiers, "Don't fight for honor, don't fight for glory, don't fight for gold because you're not going to get any. If the enemy comes through that gate, it'll be your gold they take, your homes they burn, your women they'll rape. So let's go kill them."
Uh-huh. Meanwhile, the obvious specter of no society on Earth really condones the rape of women, and the only reason they condone the rape of the enemy's women is because they dehumanize the enemy.
Yeah,
And usually, the greatest thrust of war is just I have particular desires about how women should be treated, and they are not catering to my specific desires or ideas about how women should be treated. Therefore, they must be mistreating them, and therefore, it's okay to dehumanize them because what human being doesn't care about the women's?
you're, you're thinking like, I think it's also possible that a lot of wars have started due to a misunderstanding, because it's only been recently that we're able to communicate with each other effectively all across the world in different cultures. Like, I think when you have people who are unable to communicate, misunderstandings can arise, and you know some cultures, customs and traditions, they may seem like incredibly barbaric when you aren't able to communicate with somebody and give, like, they're able to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it.
It happens even in semi-related cultures if there's enough if there's enough demarcation or distance between them. I was watching a thing earlier today about what King George thought of the Revolutionary War as it was happening. And it struck me the main reason why the Revolutionary War was such a prolonged, bloody thing was he and his court had certain axioms or assumptions about how the colonists think, and the colonists thought differently, but nobody was willing to simply go to King George and explain, you are wrong about how we think, sire. This is how we actually think. Could we get some proper representation? If
Well,
that had
didn't they?
happened, then
Well,
this
thing is,
entire
didn't they?
rigmarole could have been avoided.
Well, then we wouldn't have a country. And then,
Well, yeah.
hold on, but didn't the colonists petition the king for a place in parliament and were denied?
Yes. Because and this is very funny to me looking at modern day culture wars and seeing similar patterns. He assumed that the people who were advocating for said representation were just a small, discontented but loud minority. And upon realizing this, I laughed for like 20 minutes straight because as somebody who's been involved in the various pop culture gates, if you like, how many times have we heard the "we're not going to cater to your whims because you're obviously just an irrelevant minority that just happens to speak loudly," while simultaneously also being the same on the other side. Oh.
Yeah, that's another thing. Wars often fight because like say people are oppressed. Eventually, like all human beings have a breaking point where they are willing to fight and die uh, before live continuing to live in these conditions. And like this has been shown all throughout human history. There have been uprising, rebellions, insurrections, slave revolts. Like imagine in ancient Rome, Spartacus, that was a slave revolt.
Yes. Yeah, him and several, I believe, thousand of his gladiators were just like, yeah, no, we're not doing this anymore. And to be fair to him, gladiators were often given temporary like officer roles in warfare, and that was basically how Spartacus gained the military strategy necessary to foment his rebellion. Was he was actually considered a fairly competent general, and then when he got home and returned to the gladiatorial life and realized that the gladiatorial life sucked in comparison to being treated as a war hero, um, the old "do you hear the people sing" treatment happened.
Uh, you know, war. I feel like there used to be, I don't know, like agreed upon standards for war.
Yeah, there used to be rules of engagement or elements of, even as we are fighting, we do respect each other's humanity in some sense. We just want to hash out this particular. And I came to this conclusion earlier today as I was thinking about this ahead of today's show. Um, I think the main problem with modern warfare is there's no longer a human element to it because of guerrilla warfare and because of no rules of engagement and because of no battle lines or close quarters combat being an element of it anymore. It's starting to, it has become something that, war has always been avoidable, but sometimes, a thing you desire to avoid but can be engaged in if necessary, to something that is literally a almost Lovecraftian nightmare. And I did start wondering how much better would modern civilization be if we did have to engage in battle lines, charges, and close quarters combat like in the old days? Because now you can take a human life from thousands of miles away by the push of a button, whereas before you engaged in battle lines, you engaged in structured arrangements. You broke into close quarters combat, and if you wanted to take a life, you actually had to physically take it. You had to get in close to someone and watch the life leave their eyes.
Thing
And
is,
yes,
even with
go ahead.
the development of guns, like there were still like gun lines. You were still staring down the enemy.
Yeah,
Um,
because you couldn't shoot from literally all the way across the battlefield. You still had to get into a position that was a reasonable firing position.
yeah, the little lines don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. You could still like see like your
Yeah, there
enemy's
was
eyes and
there
know
was
that that is the
still a
person that you're
reflection
firing
of
at.
yourself that you were being faced with.
Yeah. But I think really what things changed was when the people making the decisions, like generals, were able to relay orders and give commands while not actually being on the battlefield itself. Like, say you have a general who's ordering things at a war, but he's not seeing the men fighting, he's not seeing them dying. He's looking at like numbers on a spreadsheet or troop like figures on a
Yeah,
map.
he's hearing the stories post hoc without needing necessarily to be involved with it himself, and then it just becomes how many men do I have to throw at the enemy before it's accomplished?
Really, I think this is best exemplified in World War One with the introduction of mechanized warfare and trench warfare.
Yep.
Well, first of all, the conditions inside the trenches were god awful.
That
Like,
there are visions of hell that are more humane than trench warfare.
yes, like it would be wet. They would get trench foot, like gangrene. Like they would run out of food. There would be like mice running through the
Yeah,
trenches.
more people died from the lack of sanitary conditions than they actually died from the actual engagements.
Yeah, eventually, when they ran out of food, they would just have to hunt down the rats and try and eat them. Like it was god awful. Like
Yeah,
I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
it's one of the most physically debilitating wars that we ever fought, and it's not even due to the scale of the conflict. It had more to do with the just hellish, fucking Lovecraftian nature of the fighting.
Like you could be waiting in those shitty conditions for weeks before you even engage the enemy. And the thing is, when you engage the enemy, like you'd usually maybe fire some pot shots at them, like over the trench line, or maybe, God help you, you were given the order to charge the enemy line, climb up and try and run across no man's land and get gunned down by machine gun fire.
Yep, and what's more, in relation to the whole generals and politicians ruling from afar thing, I do wonder how much the ever constantly beating war drum is due to the fact that for like half a century after women were given the right to vote, they were never ever going to be drafted as a result of this, and therefore more than half of the electorate were allowed to vote on wars in which they had no stake generally.
Some might argue the stake would be they would be sending their son, brothers, fathers, husbands off to fight and potentially die, but
And for
that's not the same thing.
a lot of people, I'm sure that worked and that was a decent deterrent. But when all you can think of is the faceless, uh, if you don't have a significant male presence in your life, or if you just don't care enough, or if you see it mostly as yes, but my husband or my son or my brother is not going to likely die. It's going to be one of the hundreds of thousands of other men that are likely to die, and therefore I don't care. It puts a lot of money on the notion of um women's abstract morality, and I'm not disparaging women as a group or anything, but there's only so much you can make it matter to yourself in the abstract. And when warfare itself is also becoming increasingly more abstract and less personal, that also adds yet another element of, at least while it was close quarters combat and battle lines, you actually had to take a life if you wanted to take it. Now, oh look, I hit a button and 10,000 people that I didn't know randomly died. Funny that. Moving on.
Yeah. And that's another thing too. Like when you're facing down the enemy, you know this is the enemy because they're staring right back at you, preparing to fight in a war. Now, if you say we're to launch a drone strike, you have an approximation that that person is your enemy, but you don't. But it's can be difficult to know for sure, and that's why we're seeing a lot of, I believe, increase in civilian casualties. Like you
Yeah,
have intelligence that the person is there, but you're not
yeah.
looking at
There
them
are
when
there
you
are
launch that
no
strike.
more battlefields now. An entire territory becomes a battleground. Like
Yeah, and
you used to have to physically go to the agreed upon place in which to fight and fight them. Now you can just wander into what would be the equivalent of someone's living room and go, boop.
yeah, and I think that this is another problem because like when you have civilian casualties, it's going to be like so much worse when you're not the one who's actually there because once you hit that thing, you can't stop it.
And also it's going to radicalize the enemy like a motherfucker if because there is some value to there being a distance between the average civilian and the average soldier. But when the average civilian is faced with the psychological and physiological consequences of a war zone with no training, with no warning, with no um, standards of engagement, you do that to a soldier, that's going to leave a mark. That's why PTSD, which is not a modern phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination, by the way, has been a thing for as long as warfare pretty much has been a thing, or at least as far as we can document it. In the old days, it was referred to as nostalgia. That was the original use of the term. And in slightly more modern era, it was referred to as shell shock. Only recently have we started referring to it as PTSD, but that does not mean PTSD is a modern phenomenon. Although I do wonder how much it's made worse by the abstract, impersonal aspect of it. Because at least before you could know the name of the person, like as archetypical and silly as some of the Norse sagas were, there's a reason why um, the standard line between Viking warriors was, "Who are you and what have you done that I might know who I kill?" And then they would proceed to give a list of the various accomplishments. And a similar thing happened in ancient Greece and Rome as well, of like, I am the son of X person, and I have done this, this, and this, and my family line has done this, this, and this. It wasn't just a brag or a roast, although that was an aspect of it. It was a look how awesome I am, so that you don't. Part of it, I'm sure, was psychological warfare of like, do you really want to fight me who has done X, Y, and Z things? But it's also so that we can engage each other like equals and engage with each other as human beings. You should know who
There,
I am, what I have done, and what I stand to lose, and I should know what you have done and what you stand to lose, etc.
there would be some respect there, and also, I think it's a way of making sure that, like, say, if I die, I have given this person who I am, where I am from, and my accomplishments. You're not going to forget that person.
No, it's and it helps. It helps you, I'm sure, also just and to be perfectly fair, I am not a warrior by any stretch of the imagination. I am a scholar. Like I would not be on any battle lines ever, even if I was forced to. But at least as far as I understand it, if you know this about these people, you also kind of by proxy gain their accomplishments if you win, and that sort of makes the reason you're fighting more real to you. Whereas now, just no, entire family lines just off the map because I say so, because button hit. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and the thing about warfare too is that when you have to fight like with melee weapons and not with guns, not that I have anything against guns, but there is an element of skill involved. Like you have to actually be extremely well trained with the weapon that you're using if you're not going to get killed yourself. Like
Yeah, not to go full Obi-Wan Kenobi, but I empathize with Obi-Wan Kenobi's statement about lightsabers being a more civilized weapon for a more civilized age, because there was actual craft and skill in sword fighting. Not to say there's no craft or skill in marksmanship. It's, there are certainly marksmen that would put certainly any of us to shame, but because there's that because there's that little aspect of distance of the weapon is the one that does most of the work at the end of the day, whereas with a sword it's more of an extension of your person, or with any handheld weapon it's more of an extension of your person, whereas in marksmanship you almost become an extension of the gun more so than it becomes the extension of you.
not only that, but you can stop a melee weapon like mid swing or mid thrust. Like once you pull the trigger on that bullet is going whether you want it to stop or not.
Now, if you suddenly have an attack of conscience after pulling the trigger, well, goody for you, Sonny. You might squeeze the camel through the eye of the needle when the afterlife comes up. But
Not even that,
y-
but if say like you pull the trigger and all of a sudden like the people within the line of fire change and all of a sudden there's an innocent civilian
yeah,
there.
somebody randomly wanders into the line of fire. Oh no, I've killed people that I didn't even intend to kill. How am I ever going to live with this?
But I think also the introduction of um, warplanes has also changed a lot because now you're not just fighting people on the ground, but like death could come at you like from above.
Yeah.
And not only that, but I've always found like dogfighting in warplanes to be very interesting
Hmm.
because it's like it's fighting in a way that human beings have never had before, and like 300 to 360 degrees, three-dimensional like fighting.
Yeah, you
Like
have
you have
you
to be
have to
wary, not
you
just the
have to
person
look to the left, to the right, and now up, whereas
and
before you
down.
only had to look left to right. Yeah.
You know, I
There's a
think that
reason why we always feared the sky as proto humans, is because if something, say a lightning bolt, comes at you from the sky, you are pretty fucked. Um, on the ground, you can defend yourself, you can put up a defense, you can do a lot of things, but very, very few human constructions can do anything at all about the air and the sky.
I mean, not only that, but I think that you know now that people have say air superiority, like even if you are in like a position like you the enemy's over there, like if they call an air support, like they can blow up your whole line.
Yeah, and the other thing is, a lot of times, bombers in particular carry the heaviest artillery and the most destructive weaponry. So not only could you die as a result of a random airstrike, like as though you were struck by lightning, but your entire like field of view and all of your comrades or all of your civilians could be gone with you.
Yeah, like think about the London Blitz, like that was just repeated bombings of a civilian city. Like it's London, the capital of Britain. Like it's filled with civilians, and it just kept getting bombed and bombed.
Yeah, and from the perspective of the pilot, people look like ants all the way down there. So again, it's yet another case of distance plus dehumanization equals abstract mindfuck.
I think we should talk about the Vietnam War because that was just an absolute clusterfuck.
Uh-huh. The war lost at home before it was ever lost on the battlefield, as the old saying goes.
These, I don't think we ever should have been in Vietnam, really.
No, it was a very stupid idea to begin with, and that's why it was so easy to lose at home. Because when we were fighting the Nazis, we were fighting the Nazis. Whereas when we were fighting in Vietnam, everyone who was even casually interested in it went, wait, why the fuck are we all the way over there in a random island in the middle of the like Asiatic area of the world? Why what? This makes no sense.
I mean, not only that, but I don't think it was we were very well suited for combat over there. I mean, think about it. It's on their home turf in a place that's filled with uh, jungle where they
Yep.
could very easily set traps and did set traps. And
Yeah, and they also fought in ways that we weren't accustomed to, which was again another case of I really miss battle lines and close quarters combat. I really wish we had never uh switched to guerrilla warfare. But here we are.
but I think the introduction of tanks was something that human beings really weren't ready for because you have this like giant impervious killing machine that can fire once and obliterate your entire squadron.
Yep. It and even more exponentially so as convenient as it was to end the Second World War in two blasts. Um we really should have waited a century or two before fucking around with nukes.
Yeah, think about it. Ev- now everybody in the world lives under threat of nuclear annihilation. Not just um, say the enemies of America, but like that's why people don't want to mess around too much with like Russia or China for fear that they'll
All of
launch.
human civilization could be gone in less than a day. If
The thing is,
if
nukes
if all
now
the
almost
nuclear
are.
powers decided to go at it, that's that's the curtain call for humanity, folks.
Recently, I believe New York State or it was the government of New York City, but they released a statement about how to potentially survive a nuclear attack, and like I believe it was Tim Pool who showed like the blast radius of like say the most powerful Russian nuke,
Yeah,
and
Bizarre
if the
Bomba.
Russians were to launch a nuke, New York is gone. There is nowhere that you in all five boroughs where you could run and be safe. You're
Yep,
gone.
yep. And if New York, one of the largest and most complicated cities that has stood for the last century or so, can be gone that quickly, then what hope is there for some random podunk town in the middle of nowhere, like the place where I'm from, or somewhere similar?
I think the only
And
saving grace would be that your town wouldn't be worth bombing.
I mean, sure, but if all the major cities around my town, like Philly is about 2 hours away, Hershey is about 2 hours away, Harrisburg is about 2 hours away. If all those places were to get bombed, which they might, it actually is less. This is very very morbid and very very macabre, but you'd be better off getting directly hit with nuclear radiation because you die before your brain even realized what was going on, most likely. Whereas the most devastating part of nukes is nuclear fallout and radiation poisoning,
Yeah,
because
that's death over
you
time.
you
And
you will you will envy the people who got hit with the thing if you happen to survive in a place that is close enough to be irradiated but not close enough to have gotten actually blasted.
let's talk about the war on terror because I feel like that makes warfare even more complicated because,
The
first of all,
stupidest, and again, it's very much like the Vietnam War, where everyone in our surrounding generation was just like, "Why are we doing this again?"
think about it, it was it's incredibly difficult because in this situation you have to fight people who don't have set borders, who may not necessarily have a set language or a location, but an ideology. And how on
Yeah.
earth are you going to know, like when you go into a town, who adheres to that ideology? Maybe they'll single themselves out, but if you they know you're looking for them, they're going to hide amongst just the regular
Yeah,
population.
and
It's going to be
the problem
extremely
is
difficult
we're
for
fighting a
you to root them
culture
out.
that's so foreign to ours that it makes it difficult anyway. Because if like England and France go to war for the 500th time in as many centuries, um, they at least have a common like European culture, whereas the Middle East and Europe and America are so different culturally that it becomes very, very easy to do the dehumanization of war thing, and then all of a sudden it's, you know, I would rather die 1,000 times than let one of the Kefir pig dogs live, and so on and so forth.
I think it's not only that, but if France and England go to war, they know who they're fighting. The English are in England and the French are in France. What, but with a war on, so like a dangerous terrorist ideology, you don't necessarily know where they are, and if you have some idea, they could very easily pick up and move.
Yeah, and then there's the problem of, the EU's immigration plan, which now has made this entire conversation a hell of a lot more difficult because now it turns out that some of those enemies of your culture are within the walls of your culture. Oops.
That was just stupid. The Germans should never lead anything.
The, the Germans should have learned their lesson from what they tried to do about a century ago. Like Frau Merkel, my 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 dear Kaiserette. Have you not learned that Germans really shouldn't be organizing international bureaucracies? Because it seems to me that every time Germans organize international bureaucracies is bad. It's not just when they do it in the name of the fatherland, but when they have a pathological guilt complex for ever having pride in the fatherland, it doesn't help things. It in fact makes it a bunch worse. Because if you remember how Rome fell, the great continent spanning monolith that was Rome, they fell largely because they outsourced their warfare and their peasantry to places like Gaul, and then they converted to Christianity, which made the Gallic polytheists rather pissed off because before Rome's policy was you can keep your gods, you just have to add a few, and now the policy was all your gods are demons. So the Gauls eventually went, you know what, fuck this Roman shit. And because so many of them were in Rome, um, Rome was no more in the space of about 20 years, bearing in mind that they had reigned for almost 2,000 at that point.
I think, you know, one of the things that makes war so terrible is not just the fighting it, even though that we've talked a lot about that, but also the aftermath.
What it
Like,
does to you.
yeah, what it does to soldiers. Not only that, but also to families whose people don't come home, and also like what
To
it does to the
society in
land.
general.
Yeah, like say you're in a community where war was fought. Well, your home is destroyed. Everything you know and cared about reduced to rubble. Like your daily life that you enjoyed, that's gone.
And here's the really fucked up part, especially with long-term wars. Like for example, I was born in 1995. I literally do not remember a time when America was not at war. And there's a reason why in George Orwell's 1984, the party made sure that even though there were only three states technically in the fucking world, they were constantly at least performative wars with each other. Because now the people of the various superstates don't remember what it was like to not be at war. They lived and died at war, and they were constantly under threat of war.
Not only that, but war gives governments a convenient enemy for the people to focus on rather than, what they're doing. Because
And
I'm
of
pretty
course,
sure we could agree that there are a lot of governments in the world that really need close examinations by their citizenry.
there's the shall we call it the Palpatine problem of governments and war, which is to say that not only does it give a convenient distraction, it also gives a perfectly justifiable reason why I needs all the powers. But don't worry, I'll give them back as soon as the war is over. Asterisk, the war will never be over, so I will never have to give these up, but never mind.
There's a saying, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program.
Yep.
And the thing is, like, I have a lot of respect for soldiers. Like, there's a lot of members of my family who served in the military, and like for everything that they have to go through, they do not like get enough help from the government. Like the U.S. government wastes so much money on just absolute bullshit, and they throw money at literally every problem. Like every government project is always late and over budget, but like the government has the people have to fight tooth and nail to get more money for like the VA.
Yep. It's because, sadly enough, and this is a men's rights show after all, um, because war is mostly fought by men, people just don't have the incentive to care. So much so that people actually care more about the woman's right to serve in the military if she should feel like it than they do about the concept of the draft, which is to say that no matter what a man feels like, if a government decides in such a way, his life is forfeit unless he is willing to go die in a ditch somewhere or possibly get blown up.
Not only that, but his life is forfeit to people who will never know his name or see his face as they order him to go and fight in a battlefield that they deem that he should fight in.
Yeah, and if one of them does deign to notice you while you're bleeding to death from several holes in the head, and you ask him, or yeah, you ask him, can we please stop this? He will say something to the effect of, "Don't worry, there's more of you," as though that is the crucial part of the story. And then of course you get the aforementioned Hillary Clintons of the world going, "Women are the true victims of war because they lose their brothers, sons, and husbands and have to live with the consequences of them not coming home rather than dying instantaneously." I've literally seen people argue that men are not the primary victims of war because they die, and therefore they only have to deal with the pain for a limited time, whereas women have to live through it and therefore bear a greater psychological burden as a result of living through it.
Dying's not that bad,
Yeah, it's living with the consequences of living without you that's the issue.
but I just I had a really good thought and then I lost it. Shit. But yeah, one thing that I always had a problem with in regards to warfare is the soldiers like when they fight like they are basically crap, I'm trying to recapture my thought, but I gotta go through my train of thought. Can you please say something? Well, I
Yeah,
tried.
the another aspect of this that disturbs me is it's one of the starkest reminders that men are only valuable for what they do. Because if you are a man and you don't want to sell your soul to your government and or your society to defend it with your own life and your own blood, then you are seen as not a man. But if you do go through the meat grinder of war and you do dehumanize your fellow humans to a ludicrous degree and come away with the PTSD and battle scars, the second peacetime is declared, you'll get the "we don't serve your kind in here, sir." So if you're useful to your society and you become a dispassionate super soldier a la the Spartans or the folks in Warhammer 40K, then you're and not only that, but as we know in the modern parlance, soldiers are examples of toxic masculinity because they don't have um, public displays of empathy, or they don't they prize strength and aggression over sensitivity and so on. Never mind that that's what you demanded they become, and that most soldiers, even the ones that are gung ho to join the army, don't want to become that. They want to become the empathetic soldier who is essentially the Superman or Captain America sort of archetype. But
No, I
they
remember.
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. No, you finish your thought, and then I'll continue.
Yeah, it just it bothers me because if you have any respect for yourself as a male human that doesn't tie your worth to what you do rather than what you aren't a real man. And if you do sell your soul to the icon of manhood in the way that a lot of soldiers do, then you are the reason why men can't have rights because you're such a dehumanizing bastard that your masculinity is a problem.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. But what I wanted to talk about is propaganda, the way that the government sell lies to young men in order to get them to join up for their war effort. Because I had a look at some propaganda from World War I, and it made it seem as if war was basically just like a sporting match. Like you would go over there with your friends, give it to the enemy, and then come home to a parade in your honor.
Yeah, the famous will worship the ground you walk on if you sacrifice for us.
Yeah,
Meanwhile, when you actually you'll get the parade when you come back, hopefully, but after that, if you say go to the bar with your friends and you happen to get too rowdy or you have a bout of PTSD in public, I'm sorry, sir, we don't serve your kind in here.
like I remember one like propaganda poster was like, "All right, boys, let's show them the strength of Australian fighting men." And it was just like, this is World War I. You're barely going to see your enemy. Like they completely like gaslit all these men into dying. And I believe it's a book. What's it called? All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah.
I believe it was about a soldier who was returning home and recanting about trench warfare to his family.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, this subject really gets to me.
Yeah, there's only so long you can do the men's rights talk before you realize just how fucked both human history and human nature in many ways can be.
I do believe that it's an honorable thing to dedicate yourself to fighting for something that you believe to be greater than yourself. But don't lie to people about it. Don't trick them. Don't gaslight them. Don't try and cajole them into joining him you when they think that they're going to get, respect and love and honor and dignity, when you're just going
Yeah,
to
you you
throw their
you
lives
you
into a
you
fucking
only you
grinder.
only have to go through the gauntlet, and then you will have truly earned your man card, and everyone will love you, or not. Because in order to be good at war, you have to make yourself a monster, and people fear monsters. So you sell
Not
you
even
sell
make,
your
not
soul in the
even
hopes
really,
of love, and you get fear.
not even become a monster, but they have to make you capable of doing monstrous things, and that will make people afraid of you.
It's very similar to the reaction and the portrayal of Starship Troopers in the movie. Um, so much of that is portrayed as toxic and fascist, when in actuality, all it is an attempt to earn the value that their society insists they earn, and then the actual act of giving that value in return is seen as an immoral imposition on the part of the soldier to the civilian.
And the thing is, say a soldier goes through training and he's in battle and he's trying his best. Some people can't handle it. Some people it's just too much. Some people they give their all, but like the horrors of war, it's overwhelming them psychologically. And say they like want to quit or leave,
Or
you can't.
or their skills could just be in an area that isn't warfare. Like
Yeah,
how
just
many
they can
how many
contribute.
great poets and artists have we lost on the basis of when they were born, it wasn't a leisurely time of art and poetry, it was a time of war. And then, whoops, they weren't any good at war, so they weren't a real man and they died screaming.
Or maybe just transfer them to somewhere where they won't have to constantly see carnage. But
Ah,
like
but all of those positions are being filled by the women in the administration and the nursing divisions. So there isn't any room for any inferior men, and we wouldn't give it to them even if there were, because that makes them non-real men, and we don't have respect for male humans who don't earn their man cards by doing things and being useful.
yeah, and say you go AWOL, say you try to run because you don't want to be in this horrific mind altering situation anymore. You don't
Then
want to
you are
kill or
contemptible.
be
You are
killed.
the villain. You are evil.
Yeah, you are a traitor to your friends, to your country. You are abandoning your duty, and they will throw you in jail for the crime of not wanting to fight a
You are
war.
you are you are simultaneously a lily-livered weakling who can't cut it, but also a Machiavellian brute who must be malevolent or traitorous.
I think that if humanity is ever going to, at the very least, ease tensions and back away from the precipice, because a lot of people are thinking with the current state of the world, we might be on track for World War III, which would just be absolutely devastating.
Again, nukes could destroy every recognizable aspect of human civilization in a day. And then within a month after that day, like 70% of the entire human race would be dead from radiation poisoning, at least.
I think if we're going to back off from this, then we need to get back to leaders leading from the front.
Yeah.
And people act like politicians are so important. Like the president, uh, we need to, you know, protect him because he's a very valuable position. Like he is, but we like. vote on presidents every 4 years.
Yeah.
Like,
The irony of ironies is one of the duties of the president is supposed to be as a commander in chief. And the thing is, there were presidents throughout history that actually did their. I mean, George Washington himself was the quintessential general of the Revolutionary War. But nowadays, the political class, whether it be actual politicians, whether it be journalists, whether it be writers, etc., they're basically treated not like um, distinguished war heroes or imperators, to use the Roman term. In fact, that was actually the original use of the term emperor. It was considered to be basically the highest rank of general. But now they're nothing but the aristocracy. And aristocrats can't be arsed to worry about the plebs, because what could I possibly have to care about with regard to all these peasants that I keep sending to die?
it's
And
basically
we
like,
wonder why governments are so fucked up.
yeah, decisions about the fate of the country and, soldiers' lives are being made by people who have no skin in the game. Like, even like they didn't serve in the past, or like they'll lose nothing by engaging in war in the present.
Yeah. As far as I'm concerned, we have two options, folks. We have two options for what I would consider a just and egalitarian future. Option one, we abolish the draft entirely and make conscription entirely voluntary, so that at the very least, the civilizations that people fight for would have to do a good job of convincing them to go. Or we can draft both men and women. Because that, I think, is one of the main hurdles for why we keep blowing all these male human lives on all these irrelevant wars, is because we consider women to be the valuable humans, and none of the valuable humans are expected to do anything unless they want to. Maybe we should start drafting both men and women so that we actually can be sparing with our war trigger fingers, because you
I
can't
mean, they
you can't
didn't they
tell
sign a
me
bill?
that we wouldn't be more careful about sending people to war if we knew that women also had to go.
Didn't they recently sign a bill saying women had to sign up for the draft?
That they there was a court case recently where they ruled a male only draft to be unconstitutional. But I don't think that translated into, and therefore let's draft women. I think that translated into, we should consider ending the draft, but we're not actually going to. Which, to be fair, I would be fine with a situation where we drafted no one, where conscription was entirely voluntary, and therefore governments and civilizations had to at least convince the people that the fight they were having was worthwhile, and therefore would also have to be more sparing about which conflicts they thought, because that's the other problem I have with war in the modern era, is we no longer have to prioritize wars that are actually worth fighting, or that we can convince people that they're actually worth fighting. The last war where we even bothered doing that was World War II. And that one was pretty unquestioningly worth fighting, because we were fighting freaking Nazis on one side and fascists on the other. So, bully for us, we actually were fighting a necessary fight for once. But every
Even
war
then, you
after
got
that
dragged
has
into
been
it
completely
because you got
useless.
attacked.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, yeah, but yeah, I think that the draft should be abolished and conscription should be entirely voluntary, and B, as a result, hopefully, of that, the powers that be will have to be more selective about which wars they actually engage in, or at the very least, get good enough at convincing people to willingly go that they'll actually want to willingly go. Because I
I
don't
mean,
mind
that's gonna
wars that are
happen.
actually worth fighting, but most of them
Have you
are
seen
irrelevant.
the numbers? Like, military recruitment is way down. There's going to be a lot of positions that they won't just have the staff to fill. And also, have you seen, like, you remember that recruitment ad about like the little cartoon girl with two moms who wanted to join the army because feminism.
I vaguely remember that, yes.
Like those are the ads that are being shown to people to try to convince them to join the United States military. Who on earth would join from
And
that?
and here's the other thing. This is yet another case of the feminist ideology and instinctive gynocentrism really fucking each other over. Um, the idea that war is a luxury that men have and women don't is one of the single most evilly stupid. It is both stupidly evil and evilly stupid things I have ever heard. War is a burden that men have had to bear. That's why I consider the draft to be basically a Faustian bargain, because it literally does amount to sell your soul and or your life to your state or your government or your society, or your rights as a human are entirely irrelevant and will be revoked from you. Your man card is nothing if you don't make yourself useful, and the most primary way you can make yourself useful is to be living flesh and blood cannon fodder at our whims. And yet there's no need for men's rights, is what they keep saying. But no, it isn't a glory, it isn't a virtue to throw yourself in a human meat grinder for the sake of your civilization. It is a duty that some people are burdened with for the sake of other people, and they should be honored for that sacrifice as and when they feel free and willing to make it, because that is a hell of a calculation to have to make. But do not treat it as though women are oppressed by not being treated like human cannon fodder, please.
I mean, not only that, but if you want people to willingly join in battle, like they're going to need leaders that people trust with their lives. Would you trust these people with your lives? Because I wouldn't.
There is not a single politician on this planet that I would be willing to even begin to hand a gun to. Like I would sooner believe that every politician currently on this planet would sooner shoot me and take my wallet than let me live if they were given that option.
Well, think about you mentioned George Washington's Revolutionary War. Like, think about them, like their leaders, like in say the Continental Congress. They knew that their lives were at risk as well. Like, if they lost to England, all those men would be executed for treason.
Yeah,
So, like the leaders and the soldiers, they all had their lives on the line fighting this war.
yeah, and again, they actually had to convince people to follow them willingly instead of just declaring it so. And what's more, the thing that makes me probably the most proud to be American I've ever been, when George Washington won the Revolutionary War for us, and he was offered a crown, he responded, "Do you really think I just fought a war to dethrone George III in order to become George I?" And that is something that makes the American Revolution different from almost every other revolution that we've ever seen in the modern era. When Robespierre was offered the crown, he took it. When Joseph Stalin was offered the equivalent of the crown, he took it. When Mao Zedong, same thing. When Fidel Castro, same thing. But when George Washington was offered the crown, he was firm enough in his conviction and his principles to say, "Fuck no, I just fought a war to end kings. I'm not going to become a king." Is
Not only
there a
that, but
single politician alive today that would make that choice if they were given the option?
like not only that, but when he became president, he willingly served 2 terms. It was his choice to step down. Like there was
Yeah, and it
no.
was it was a precedent until Roosevelt, when Roosevelt was elected for a third term, and after that they put in law that it was only two, which honestly I say term limits for all politicians, and more importantly, term limits that actually have a limit on them, because term limits cease to matter if you can just be constantly reelected to the same office over and over again.
Politicians now will literally die before they give up power.
Yep, there is no and again, it's not like this is a modern phenomenon because we can see it in almost every other major revolution through history that Washington was quite alone in his scruples of refusing power when it was offered to him on a silver platter. So one one has to be reminded of the old adage of those who seek power are probably the least likely to use it well, and those who would never take power are probably the only ones who have the capacity to use it properly.
Now the thing is, like, politicians can be the absolute worst, most unworthy people in the country and still get reelected because, like, of who they're affiliated with, um, as a political party. And I think personally, the best thing would do would be to abolish the political party system, let each candidate run as an independent, where they can't stand on the virtues of, say, like a party platform. They have to stand on the virtue of themselves and themselves alone.
And for those that I can already hear going, at least they were elected democratically, here's the thing, I'm gonna say something incredibly controversial now, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I think old school aristocracies were better than modern politicians because in order to be the old school aristocracy, you were expected to actually um, earn your status to some degree, i.e., if you were a king, you were expected by everyone else in your family to earn the crown by your deeds and by your education and by your skills. There was this concept, no, and there was also this concept known as noblesse oblige, i.e., those who rule over a given people are obligated to those people. Whereas now, our modern aristocracy, whether they be democratically elected or not, want all the same grandeur, all the same pomp and circumstance, all the same authority, with none of the classical education standards, with none of the philosophical erudition, and with none of the obligations to those they rule over.
Like, say, like, the New York Met Gala. You cannot tell me that isn't just a modern day version of Versailles.
Oh no, it's worse because again, at the very least, at the very least, Louis and Marie had to display competency, erudition, and good taste in both, intellectual pursuits, art, etc. Now they have all of the clout and all of the money with none of the sense of good taste. I put it to you that there is not a single person who attended that fucking gala who wouldn't have agreed with the postmodernist art is entirely subjective and there's nothing meritocratic about it approach to art. And if I am wrong, may I be struck by lightning.
I mean, do you remember the whole "just let them drive Teslas" campaign they were going on about when talking about the beginning of
Like
the gas?
I love Elon. I do. I think he's one of the better of our betters in this day and age. But yeah, that was a Marie Antoinette moment if ever I had heard one. And no, she didn't actually say that. I know it's an apocryphal story, but it's so damn applicable to so many things.
Just the thing that led to the French Revolution was that the aristocracy was greatly out of touch with the citizenry, and now it's even worse because, at least with the European aristocracy, their wealth and, you know
You could
all
you
the
could be you could be disinherited from a family no matter where you were in the family line if you didn't excel at the various skills and aspects of rulership that you were supposed to, like, in even in the Middle Ages there was a class of literature known as mirrors for princes, probably the most famous of which was Antonio Machiavelli's or Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. But it was a series of books for young royals to explain what their duties were and what was expected of them as monarchs, and if they didn't fill those positions, they were likely to be disinherited. And it was
Not
only
only that,
when the aristocracy started losing that touch that people started going the guillotine route.
not only that, but like the wealth of the nobles was directly tied to the people. Like their wealth came from the taxes that they collected from the people. If the people weren't doing well enough to pay taxes, the nobles would feel that.
Yeah. You were also expected to be a patron of the sciences, the arts, and basically every other meaningful kind of human endeavor as a royal, both in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. Now, what they do instead of patronage is the various social justice initiatives. Now, mind you, the patronage of yesteryear used to include people like Leonardo, Lorenzo de' Medici being the patron of Leonardo da Vinci, um, the various classical composers being patronized by everyone from German monarchs to the Habsburgs to the French and English royalty, etc. John Dee was Elizabeth's spy master and also her court magician, etc. Those were the class of people that we used to patronize. Now we patronize the moral order of social justice. Do you not see how fucked up that is? That the allegedly modern version is infinitely worse. And this is why I have a tiny amount of respect for Elon Musk, because he appears to know what's expected of him as an aristocrat, and he's willing to abide by those restrictions, and he actually does use his wealth to further science or art or etc. instead of our abstract moral decorum herder. And abstract
It's
moral
all about
decorum is exactly what led to the old school revolutions. People got so fed up with their abstract moral woo-woo bullshit that they were just like, no, fuck this.
the thing is like before when yeah, I feel like we're getting off the topic of warfare,
Yeah,
but
the duality of men and aristocracy might have to be a thing one of these days.
yeah, but when soldiers came home, from old war, they could, at the very least, you know, be sure that you know their efforts were going towards something. There
And
was a material um, representation of their efforts, either through gold or land or whatever. They know what they accomplished, but
and tying it back to the old school aristocracy point that we were just making, when you were given an award for upstanding service in the old days, it wasn't just a performative, slap on the back. You literally got a castle or land or a certain number of whatever currency happens to be the
maybe even a
going
title,
currency at the time, etc. Like
maybe
it
even like a
actually,
minor title.
yeah, it actually was a meaningful award. And you're right, it would often be a way that a non-aristocrat could prove himself worthy and be elevated to the status of aristocrat, which again might be why the aristocrats of old, at least for the most part, had their heads on straight and considered their duties more, because a lot of them were generals or the descendants of people
I
who
mean,
were great
not only
generals.
that, but they would often have their own sons lead militarily.
Yeah, and also there was this possibility that they would wind up at the very least in an advisor role to whatever monarch they happen to be serving. When was the last time that our advisors to the aristocracy of the modern era actually had to prove their worth by accomplishing something meaningful in their field, which might go a certain way to explain why modern day economists and pollsters are such irrelevant twits, because they've been in the aristocracy so long they no longer recognize what actual consequences look like.
Not only that, but often they'll change the information to what the person wants to hear or what they want them to know. Because if you remember, when Donald Trump was president, he wanted to pull our troops out of Syria, and then like I think it was General Milley or it was some like intelligence agency or maybe the DoD lied to him about how many troops were in the area so that we could keep troops in Syria.
Uh-huh.
Like that is exceedingly dangerous
That is
because the
also
men who would
something that would
remain
have gotten
there,
you
they
tried for treason in the old days.
yeah. So I'm just
Yeah.
like the
For the
people who
record, I am a
are
freedom-loving American who hates the very concept of aristocracy. Because it probably seems like I'm doing a lot of defending of the aristocracy in this particular live stream. But all I'm saying is, if we must have an aristocracy, I prefer the one that actually believes in things like meritocracy, skill, merit, and the obligations of the nobility, rather than the aristocracy who actively disdains any concept of meritocracy or any concept of populism. Because in what sane world does it make sense for any democratic or pseudo democratic civilization to shun populism? Because little bit of linguistic spurging here. The word populace is Latin, and if you translate that Latin word to Greek, that word is demos, from which we get the word democracy. So, in any sane world, if there is a democratic organization or a pseudo democratic organization that is not populist in some meaningful sense, then somebody has fucked up. And notice, please, the nouveau riche phrase "our democracy" means the democracy of the valid people. Do you know what we call it when there's a democracy but only among the valid people? The word is aristocracy, or in
like
French, the noblesse.
or oligarchy.
Well, I I'm not using the word oligarchy because it's a fairly new phenomena. Um, but in actuality, what we have now is just a worse version of the aristocracy. You know, when they say our democracy, translate it in your head to democracy among the valid people. And for valid people, they mean aristocrats. That's what they meant this whole time, and that's all they're ever going to mean by our democracy. They mean if you are not what we consider a morally or intellectually valid person, you don't get a voice in our democracy. Only the valid people get to speak. And when only the valid people have a say in the democracy, that is no longer a democracy. That is aristocracy.
I think let's we're at an hour and 23, but there's one last thing I want to talk about before we go. It's the most recent military bungle in recent memory, the pullout of uh, Afghanistan.
Hmm.
So, we had been in there for what I believe 20 years, and President Donald Trump initially set a pullout date in from Afghanistan in May, but when he lost the election and Joe Biden came in, he wanted to push it to September 11th for some reason. But
Because of the abstract symbology of it, it began on 9/11. It will end on 9/11. Herder.
that was just dumb. But anyway,
Again, when the aristocracy gets so preoccupied by their abstract morality that they lose touch with anything resembling their own people or their own duties, that is a time where we might want to consider some guillotine. Is all I'm saying.
yeah, but anyway,
Viva la revolution!
President Trump had made a deal with the Taliban and the Afghan government to basically pull out, gradually, and they would be gone by May. But when President Biden, decided to keep the troops in longer, the the leaders of the Taliban basically saw this as a breach of the agreement that they had made with the United States government. They didn't care who was in charge. They didn't care that we had a change of leadership. They just know that they made an agreement and it was
and
broken.
and this is the thing. When we've asked and gotten a meaningful answer out of other countries as to why they don't like dealing with America or democracies, this is exactly the answer they give. It's because the deals we make with one guy might be invalid come the next cycle because you guys change leaders so often. And wouldn't you go right ahead and know it? All that Joe Biden accomplished in the Afghanistan debacle was proving the Sultan's point there of how fast the weather can change in a democratic alliance, i.e., you can swear up and down with one face that you're going to do one thing, but the second the electorate changes, whoops, now we have to start over from scratch with the new guy, and there's no sense of honor in between.
You
I
know,
really wish they weren't. I really wish the Middle East wasn't right about this, but when the QED is that blatant, I have to doff my hat to them.
yeah. So not only they bungled the pullout spectacularly because they pulled out like at night and did not inform the allies in the Afghanistan government that we were pulling out, which allowed the bases, which for some reason were still filled with military equipment, to be, looted
I
by the Taliban. And then, like, we had airfields that we could have flown planes out of, but we abandoned them for some reason. And we pulled all the way back to Kabul, which turned into a massive mess because there was only one airfield in Kabul that we could fly planes out of, and then the Taliban started rolling over the rest of the country, and we were trying to not only get our own soldiers out, but also Afghanistan citizens who had assisted the United States because we knew that they would be targeted to the Taliban, but it was very difficult because, like I said, we only had one airfield where we could fly planes out of, so people were like climbing the fence, like jumping onto like the wings of the plane and trying to hold on as it flew away. Like women were throwing their babies over the fence, hoping that the American soldiers would pick them up and take them to America. And then, amidst all that, there was the terrorist attack, which ended up killing, I believe, 13 U.S. service members.
I don't mean to be incredibly condescending about this, but when you just mentioned they left all of the military hardware there, all I could think was, is one of the lessons that children are taught when they first become children not tidy up after yourself before you leave a place? Maybe this is just me being old fashioned and not being apace with my generation, because I do know that among like millennials and Gen Zers, whenever they go to a place, they often do just leave garbage everywhere, which is not
I
something that
don't.
I was ever taught to do. And I, whenever I go somewhere, I always make sure that me and all the people I'm with do our best to tidy up after ourselves. But when I was a kid back in the not too distant past of the late 90s and early 2000s, tidying up after yourself before you leave a place is like one of the earliest, like this is some Barney level shit here. And yet the vast bureaucracies of the American government and the modern aristocracy couldn't pass the word down the line to, oi boys, make sure you take everything we brought with us so that we don't leave anything behind. Is this not like literal child play at this point? God damn it.
I mean, not only was it like weapons, but also like helicopters, planes. Not only that, but also files. Like there were devices there with biometric data from, I believe,
So
like
so they
U.S.
literally pulled a millennial hotel guest thing where they just left their garbage lying there hoping the maid would get it. Well,
Not only that,
guys, there isn't an international equivalent of the maid service. You're gonna have to take the things you brought with you if you want to keep
I
them.
mean, they should have. They should have evacuated that stuff out, destroyed it, or made sure that they turned the base over to the legitimate Afghan government. Because if they had, maybe the government wouldn't have fallen as fast as it did.
Yeah. It's just, guys, again, I'm having a hard time not correlating this with literal like things we tell children. Tidy up after yourself and make sure you take everything valuable with you when you leave.
Not only that, but they evacuated most of the soldiers before they evacuated the civilians. And, you know, even when the last military plane left, there were still U.S. civilians left behind in Afghanistan, despite the government trying to gaslight everybody into saying that there were no civilians left behind in Afghanistan. And, the thing is, they were supposed, like, everybody called the Biden administration the adults in the room. They have never once taken responsibility for literally anything that they have done. They have always tried to pass the blame on to everyone else about everything.
Ah, but ye, don't you understand? We are the valid people, and the valid people abide by different rules because we don't have to abide by the peasants' rules. That's what we make to enforce upon the peasants. We don't actually believe any of that. Nope.
Are you
It's
familiar
the,
with the misery index?
huh?
Are you familiar with the misery index?
Yes, I do. I haven't looked at it in a while, but yes, I'm familiar.
According to the recent numbers, look, the American people are as miserable as they have ever been. Like,
I, I
unemployment
can,
is high, inflation is high, gas prices, war tensions are flaring up. Like, the country is in an absolutely miserable state.
and again, I'm waiting for somebody to come along with the guillotines. I'm not sure if it's going to be the Antifa types or if it's going to be the like Uber tradcons, but one of these moralistic twits is going to set off a powder keg.
I
Mark
mean, come
mark my
on,
words.
Antifa has been trying to light that powder keg for like the last 10 years now.
Yeah, but I part of me wonders if this might be one of the few cases where the like tradcon evangelical moralists and the social justice antifa moralists are going to actually be standing arm in arm with each other when shit hits the fan.
I don't think so, because I think they came
In
together
a
too.
in a at least we're not the establishment sort of way.
I feel like if the tradcons tried to team up with Antifa, Antifa would just attack them.
I mean that's true too. I'm just wondering, is it going to be more the proud boy girl return to tradition people that end up getting fed up first, or is it going to be the Antifa? It, although there is one saving grace of all of this, which is the midterms are coming up. And in a sane world, which I know we don't really live in, but in a sane world, what would happen in the midterms is the grassroots um, populist libertarian aspects of the left and the grassroots populist libertarian aspects of the right will kick the ass of the establishment, and the entire establishment will be like, but we had all the clout and the money. What could possibly have happened? It's because the clout and the money don't actually matter all that much if you don't actually use it for anything meaningful, my dears. This is a very simple fact of the life, but you appear to have completely missed it. So we're going to have to learn it the hard way over again, I guess.
The only problem
But
would be like if the like even if people are populist, like that doesn't mean they would necessarily be good leaders. Like AOC is a
no,
populist. Like if
but
AOC became the president of the United States, I will legitimately flee because holy shit, we're screwed.
but 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 what I'm saying is if the because what's happening now, I think, is likely to going to be a paradigm shift, a shift away from elitist, neoliberal, neoconservative, establishment, aristocratic thinking to both sides of the political aisle offering what their version of populist libertarianism is. And you can make arguments one way or the other of which of these is better and which of these is worse and so on and so forth. But what I am saying is come hell or high water, a a a political paradigm where both sides are populist, libertarian, and non-interventionist is inherently better than a paradigm where everyone is an old school fuddy-duddy neoliberal or neoconservative and they all worship at the altar of authority and the establishment. So even with the AOCs, I will take an AOC over a Chuck Schumer or a Nancy Pelosi. And even with the aspects of Trump that I don't really like, I will take a Trump over a Mitt Romney type any day out of the week, or a Dick Cheney, there are a lot of establishment politicians on both sides, but I think their time of reckoning is either coming in the midterms or it's going to come at the end of a metaphoric sword. I prefer the establishment gets routed by populists and libertarians rather than the establishment gets routed by reckless anarchistic fuckwits. But you know, it's going to get routed, and the paradigm is going to shift one way or the other. I just hope that the people who are at least nominally populist, libertarian, and non-moralistic will be the ones that win instead of the um, moral terrorists who fight over. We want to return the world. We want to turn the world into Pleasantville. No, we want to turn the world into Demolition Man. And then those of us in the middle going, how about either? We'll get lost in the scuffle.
There's a quote that I want to end on from John Quincy Adams uh, about America. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well wisher to freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will commend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant symphony of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting under others' banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. This man was a prophet.
Yeah, I I think the founders were quite a bit. They weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they at least were informed enough and intelligent enough to create a lasting paradigm. Their only fault seems to have been not going far enough. But to be absolutely fair to them, there's no possible way they could have known all the ways the future would come up with to fuck itself. And I'd say they did their best with what they had. Certainly better than anything I could have done with the intellectual property of the 17th century.
Okay.
It's
Uh,
obvious now because they made it obvious. It was not obvious at the time. They were ahead of that, ahead of it.
all right, we've been going for an hour and 38 minutes. I believe now is a good time during the stream.
Yep.
All right, everybody. I've been Mystery.
I've been Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator. This has been the Duality of Man. And do be careful out there. It might get confusing before it gets better.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers, guys.